But as you know, in China, you should bring nice gifts to the people you're dealing with. They had, in New York, gone to Tiffany's and bought a small but very beautiful and elegant crystal clock, had it wrapped in signature pale blue Tiffany's wrapping. Pale blue is a funeral color in China. A clock is a symbol of death. So if you're starting with a joint venture partner, die. So the whole thing was misbegotten.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Are you interested in advertising with the Action Catalyst? Our listeners could be hearing about your brand right here, right now. For details, shoot us an email at info@theactioncatalyst.com.
Welcome to the Action Catalyst podcast. And on today's episode, we're pleased to welcome Jim Sebenius, Harvard Business School professor, negotiation expert, and host of the new podcast, Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators. Jim, welcome.
Well, Adam, it's nice to meet you and glad to have the chance to appear on your show.
Yeah, thank you. And where are you zooming in from today?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually Boston today, because I'm at the Harvard Business School campus, which is where my day job is. For about 20-something years, I've chaired a program called Great Negotiators, which is the program on negotiation is based at Harvard Law School. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm active over there. And, it's the professional schools at Harvard, the business school, the School of Government, the Kennedy School, the law school, and at MIT, the Sloan School and some other schools there. And at Tufts University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Brandeis. And there are about 60 faculty all told who are associated with the program on negotiation. Some are on corporate deals, some environmental, some family mediation, some really pretty much across the board. And every year or so, we collectively nominate a man or a woman from around the world who's done remarkable deals and achieved things that other people found really hard to do or impossible. And we write cases and then we bring them to campus and we record public and private interviews. And I just realized after doing this and then using that material and teaching and so forth, it really deserves a wider audience. These are just remarkable conversations. So we went all the way back to Henry Kissinger, on through George Shultz and Baker and Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell, Condi Rice, Hillary Clinton when she was secretary under Obama, John Kerry, Rex Tillerson, who actually wasn't so interesting as a secretary, but the fact that he'd been chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil and had done a ton of stuff, especially in Russia, there's some really interesting conversations there. I have this remarkable collection of sort of great negotiators from all sectors and this sidebar with the U.S. Secretaries of State. And Dealcraft results from my sort of looking at this and saying, I think this would be interesting to a lot of people. So I'm very much in the formative stages relative to a well-established one like yours. But this stuff is interesting, and the response is really positive.
That's wonderful. Well, I was looking forward to this conversation on many levels. One is that I thought I had good practice negotiating as my role as an executive coach. But when we had our two children, I've never had to exercise negotiation nearly as much as I have as a parent.
And they are instinctively fabulous negotiators. And, if you take all the normal expectations, you're much more experienced, you're much smarter, you've got much more power and money, and yet they win. And you sort of say some stuff which is pretty standard. They go to one parent, can I do it? Mom said I could. And then you go to the other one, and neither one said you could, but each don't, and then they close the deal. I remember our daughter, when she was about 3 or 4, was headed to a birthday party in a really faraway suburb. And neither my wife, Nancy, nor I especially wanted to take her out there and back, but we kind of didn't want to admit that we didn't want to take her. And so we're kind of doing this back and forth. So we finally asked, we said, Elisa, who would you like to take you out there, figuring, okay. And she said, whoever loves me the most.
Oh my gosh.
We both ended up taking her out there. The normal rules don't always work. So, for example, there used to be a real competition between her and her older brother. And each one of them, when there was something, ice cream or whatever, they wanted it. Each one wanted the biggest. And I remember at one point I said, well, you can have the biggest and you can have the hugest. And it actually worked. And I thought, that's interesting, because why in my little mind did I think that there could only be one biggest?
That's a brilliant example.
I did find with my spouse, someone told me there's an iron law of marriage, which you should always remember when you're negotiating with your spouse. You can never be happier than your spouse.
Oh,
So don't try to win.
that's one I have not heard yet. That's wonderful. Was it early on in your career where you began developing an interest along these lines?
When I look back on it, I kind of realized that it was a much earlier thing, but not something I studied. Because, like many families, mine had a lot, I don't call them feuds, but a lot of rivalries and difficult relationships. And I consistently was a person who was bridging those differences. I never thought of that as negotiating. Later, in retrospect, I realized my personality, which, okay, let me see if I can really get it from your point of view. Let's see if I can get it from your point of view. Is there something that we can, craft that sort of works? And then later, I majored in math and English in college. And then, but actually the major thing I did was debating because that's what I really loved. And then I went on an internship in Washington, which put me, really by chance with some very senior people who I learned a huge amount from. And I was put into a series of negotiations, and including one very complicated negotiation over the law of the sea. And it was everything having to do with, hydrocarbons on the outer continental shelves and fishing and shipping and deep seabed mining and the whole business. And I was, I would go to Geneva, New York, in these negotiations, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved in this. And I just found it really interesting. And that kind of led me I stayed longer in Washington, and then I switched programs. I came to Harvard and did a degree in business economics, which is basically finance and game theory, and, with an economic background, an economic, base. It just happened at that time at Harvard, there were several quite senior people who were really interested in negotiation, and myself and a good friend, Bill Urey, ended up kind of being graduate student gophers to, start what was called the Program on Negotiation something like 40 years ago. My grandfather said, "Why do you want to work for Harvard? It's a nice place, but you can't own it." Then the B school asked me to start a negotiation department, so I hired a bunch of people here.
When I hear your story, there's part of me that's always had this thought about negotiation, that there's this real technical part of negotiation, because you got to be able to, understand, in some cases, maybe financially, the table stakes and the statistics associated with it. But there's this part that you grew up with that you mentioned that made you this peacemaker in your family that probably had a lot more to do with empathy and understanding. Those are two qualities that I feel are hard to marry in this world for individuals. What's more valuable, and what do you see out there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think a spot-on observation. And here's how I think about it. A colleague, friend, and business partner of mine who actually runs my outside advisory firm tried to crystallize this in a method and in a book that's pretty distinctive, and we call it 3D negotiation. What we mean by that is the most familiar aspect of negotiation is really the people side of the process. That's the tactics, the direct interpersonal interaction. And we think of that as, the at the table piece of the story. And then there's the substantive part. That's the contents of the term sheet or the contract or the treaty or the memo of understanding or the informal understanding of what we're going to do and so forth. But that's a substance. It's not separable from the people, but the art and science of crafting deals that unlock value and do so on a sustainable basis. We call that deal design, and that's the second of the three dimensions. The third, great negotiators do almost instinctively, but a lot of people don't recognize that explicitly as part of negotiation. But that's what you can think of as the setup of a negotiation. When you're going into a deal, have you got the right parties brought into the process in the right sequence, under the right set of understandings and expectations, facing the right set of issues by the right process, and critically, facing the right consequences in the event of no deal? Because a lot of times, even though people don't think about it that way, those are actually choice variables, and you can influence them quite a lot. Probably, half to 90% of the outcome of a deal has to do with all the stuff you do before you're actually in the room. When you ask what makes a negotiation hard, if you have a target deal in mind, you want to ask, what are the barriers to that? Is it trust and communication or cross-cultural friction? Is that the problem? Is it that the deal doesn't really work for one side or the other? Is it that one side has an option that's better than the kind of deals that you're talking about, or you might? Are you dealing with an agent who doesn't have any power, or somebody has weird incentives, or, so you kind of look at those and you say, what makes this hard? What are the barriers that stand between me and the deal that I want? Then a strategy and tactics is a customized set of moves away from the table to set up the most promising situation. I only realized it actually when we were spending a lot of time, kind of unexpectedly, with Henry Kissinger and talking through a bunch of his deals. He's an interesting guy because a lot of people think of him as a war criminal and other people think of him as a brilliant statesman. And there's a kind of a battle over who the guy really was. But with Kissinger, we realized, what does he do? He does two things. First is he sort of zooms out to the big picture, the sort of analytic and strategic way that you figure out what you're trying to do in a deal and kind of how it's going to work, how it fits in with your broader approach and your broader strategy. So you sort of zoom out. But then in the actual negotiation, then you zoom in to the interpersonal. And that's where you really need to focus on the person and people with whom you're directly dealing and be as persuasive as you can, solve the problems that are there, craft agreements that make sense. And a lot of people think of it, you sort of zoom out and craft a strategy and then you zoom in and execute it. But the way it tends to work is, people zoom out and then you zoom in and you learn stuff because negotiation is not static. People make moves, new information surfaces, and you often learn that at the table, and then you zoom back out and you need to recraft your strategy. A lot of people tend to be really good at one or the other. They're great at zooming out, and they're analytical and strategic and, kind of have a brilliant conception of what has to happen and why it should and so forth. But they may be absolutely inept interpersonally. And others are so good interpersonally, but they don't have an analytic or strategic bone in their body. And you can become better at both, but most people can do it better if they're aware of it.
I love that. What were the moments that really made your palms sweat? What were some of those initial moments where you were getting your feet wet in the application of what you'd been learning?
I was fortunate in that when I was in the government and I was staffing challenging negotiations, I was working for people who themselves were pretty important and pretty prominent in the deals that they were doing. There's a whaling convention with a moratorium on taking whales and so forth. And I had a boss who was the U.S. commissioner for the whaling negotiations. And so I was there a lot and I really watched a lot of it. And I'd get, sent in to handle, subsidiary sessions and so forth. And you realize, I remember having these two thoughts. One, I have no business being here. But then I'd look around me and I'd say, actually, these people don't either. But there have been many times when I've been in the presence of people who were really tough. But I remember being involved fairly early on in a remarkable negotiation between Guinness and Grand Met that ultimately led to the creation of Diageo. And one of the people involved in that is now one of the wealthiest people in the world and an extraordinarily tough negotiator. And I just remember thinking, this guy is so smart and so tough and so rich. And I'm a pipsqueak. I mean, I can think, but I don't have any of those assets. What do we do here? What do we know about this guy? And coming to understand that in many ways, his reputation for winning was critical to his self-image and to his reputation. And is there any way that we could craft where he would not win? Now, we didn't see any way that we could win, but we did see where he might lose and we would lose. And that would be a big blow. Well, could we engineer a sort of a doomsday machine, which would lead to a loss on his side? It would to ours too. So in some sense, it was kind of crazy, but that kind of cracked things. And I just remember thinking, there usually are places that you can find. There are other things. I remember a high-tech Canadian headlamp manufacturer that wanted to sell the business to a private equity firm. And there are a few private equity firms and an industrial buyer and so forth. And it was really very, very tough. And the money that we were able to get for this was just okay, but not great. And it was kind of disappointing. And we finally just said yes to something that was, well better than the alternatives, but pretty shy of what we had aspired to. I looked at the term sheet, and the term sheet was in US dollars. And we had been negotiating implicitly in Canadian dollars, which were 79 cents to the US dollar. We said, okay. Okay, they were negotiating US dollars. Well, yeah, sure, no problem. And I just remember that told me a lot of things. First of all, No wonder they were fighting so hard, because they were like 30% above what we thought they were in real terms. The second thing I think was, it is not uncommon in negotiation for people to misinterpret aspects of the situation. And I've seen that time and again. And it's easy to sort of assume that the other side is hyper rational, or that you've got everything squared away. And much more frequently than you might expect, that is not the case.
I also think on the flip side, how do you help people see their own blind spots when they maybe don't want to?
There was a very, very interesting negotiation that I wasn't part of, but that I studied pretty carefully. The acquisition of Rolls-Royce by what was ultimately BMW. It was a really interesting process. And ultimately, they bid. In fact, they dramatically overbid relative to BMW to acquire Rolls-Royce. And yet, I got into this case because it was a disaster afterwards. It turned out that they bought the company, but there was a clause that said, if Rolls-Royce is ever bought directly or beneficially by a non-UK corporation, the name Rolls-Royce reverts to original owners. And actually some of the distinctive design elements, like the horizontal grille on the radiator and the winged victory on the top of the front of the hood. And so they bought this thing without the rights to the IP. And I thought that this was a case about due diligence. I thought, okay, this is a really good cautionary case of how people do this. Turned out when we got into it, it wasn't anything of the sort. Well, it turned out that it was very public. They basically stonewalled. So they just went ahead and bid more and bought the thing. The internal negotiations at Volkswagen, where the advisors were saying, you can't do this. And in fact, had they said, not that you'll have an IP problem or you'll lose money, but you're going to look foolish to the world. So you're kind of putting his ego on the line rather than, and it was actually, I think, the internal negotiation that failed rather than the external one. A lot of people think of negotiation as the between entities, but if you've ever been involved in one, and I'm sure you with executive coaching, you see this all the time, lots of times the internal negotiation is as or more challenging than the external ones. I remember when I was in the government and the START talks, the Strategic Arms Reduction talks, which are a long time ago, but were going to happen in Geneva between the U.S. and what was then the Soviet Union. There's a huge interagency battle over a year as to what the U.S. position and approach is going to be. And the admiral in charge of the nuclear submarine fleet was interviewed on his way to Geneva and asked about how they're going to deal with the Russians. He said, the Russians, those are number 5 on my enemies list. After the Joint Chiefs, after OMB, after the Air Force, it's kind of like, they'll be a piece of cake. And I found that in corporate situations a lot. And CEOs almost never recognize. They just say, but we're aligned. And a lot of times you're not.
It made me think of two things. It made me think of also the cultural norms that play a role. I grew up in Germany for some time, and I remember the engineers of Germany are very much you can't language instead of you shouldn't. They're color inside the lines, which makes them brilliant engineers. And sometimes culturally, they like to say you can't when you could, but you shouldn't because it's not part of the game.
Right.
And the second thing that it made me think of is how business owners often do. I mean, I get legal counsel and your thought immediately is like, they're going to play it safe. They're going to take the most legally. And so they're always telling you, no, you can't. And so you get to a place in ownership sometimes where you take the counsel, but you dismiss a lot of it to move forward with entrepreneurial initiatives.
Arrogance is a killer in negotiation, both the mistakes you're likely to make and the way that you irritate other people, even for people who have reason to be arrogant. Most of the time when you think of culture or cross-cultural negotiations, it's a very real consideration. But people tend to focus on the sort of most visible part, kind of like an iceberg where you see the part that sticks up. And sometimes that's disastrous. I do remember advising somebody who was competing to be a joint venture partner with a Chinese firm. But as you know, in China, it's customary to bring nice gifts to the people you're dealing with. They had in New York gone to Tiffany's and bought a small but very beautiful and elegant crystal clock and had it wrapped in signature pale blue Tiffany's wrapping with the white ribbon and so forth, and presented it, and the response was really horrified because in China, a clock is a symbol of death and, your mortality and the end of things. And so if you're starting with a joint venture partner, die. You know? Secondly, pale blue is a funeral color in China. So the whole thing was misbegotten. Stuff like that, the kind of kiss, bow, shake hands etiquette can screw you up or help you. Although I think it's important to get that stuff right, but I think it's also important not to mistake that for what's really going on.
What's your most proud moment in your journey as when it comes to consulting on these opportunities and these negotiations?
Well, I think one of them was that I mentioned, even though it was early in my career, figuring out how to get past this immensely powerful blocking individual and seeing that thinking this through, doing the research and coming up with something creative really worked. In some of the public sector negotiations that I've been involved in, it's, been pretty helpful to find things that genuinely were useful. And when you think you are able to help people see a different way, and I must say, when you see people who are experienced and who's just, it's really a life and death situation for how their country and their families and everything will work out. And they look at it and they've seen it in a kind of a narrow way. You kind of open possibilities and they sort of step back, even though they're very experienced, they're kind of grooved in their thinking and so forth. I think that has given me a lot of pleasure. There's a real pleasure in helping people to see things so that they can achieve more of what they want, and particularly where it matters in a positive way. I mean, sometimes you're just trying to get more than what they've got, and you better be good at that, because if you're in negotiation, that's often the case. You're buying, they're selling, and it's a contest over that. But even there, it's rarely price. There's often a lot of other stuff that's going on. As you know, at HBS, we focus mostly on the quote unquote case method. Cases are not just a few articles cut out of Business Week and stapled together and given to a class. I mean, typically you spend a lot of time in the field with the decision makers. And in my case, it's often deals in which I've been deeply involved. And then you step back, and if people are willing to talk about it, sometimes including where they've screwed up, which is, and you often learn the most from some of those. But there's something about feeling like you kind of got it right intellectually, and it was valuable to people in practice, and that helped. I think that's, for me, probably a sort of a silent source of satisfaction. I just feel lucky that I ended up kind of where I am, because it's a great platform.
Absolutely. With just the last few minutes here, what are you reading right now?
Let's see, what did I just read? I just read Nancy Pelosi's sort of autobiography. It's called The Art of Power, because she's clearly a remarkable legislative negotiator. And I remember watching when Biden said, "That's it, I'm running, no question, case closed, only the Almighty could cause me to change." 2 days later, she's on Morning Joe and she says, "We're waiting for Joe to decide whether he's going to run or not. And when he does, we will be 100% behind his decision. But that's a really important decision to make." And I'm listening to this and saying, this is interesting, and it wasn't long before it's now Kamala and not Joe. And she was operating at a time when it was roughly divided, and in the Congress could have been, completely deadlocked. And they managed to do a lot of stuff. So I was really interested in kind of seeing what she did, but she didn't really reveal too many of her secrets. It'd be interesting to spend some time and see if we could draw her out on how do you do this, not the Joe thing, because she says she has nothing to do with it, but of course, obviously, she did.
Well, Jim, if she's listening, I think she'd be a great guest for your podcast.
I think she might be a good candidate for a great negotiator. We've never had a legislator. I put it this way: I'm really impressed, but her secrets are still with her.
That's amazing. Yeah, that would be great to hear. But last question for you would be, what advice would you give to a young Jim who had been negotiating without knowing it was negotiating inside his own family? What thing do you think that Jim would need to hear from you?
I guess the first thing I would say is to recognize what you're doing and see if you enjoy it. Because I must say, even though negotiation for many people, you get scared and you sweat because there's a lot of stakes and you don't know how it's going to work out and so forth. But if you find yourself kind of into it, that's a useful internal signal. I would say if you're interested in negotiation, and I do have a lot of students, for example, who take the course and just find it almost life-changing, they often say, you can kind of go into it in a couple different ways. One is to just go into it as a field of negotiation. And there are people like Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator, or, others. I have an outside small firm. There are others that do that. But those are small, and they're kind of that's a hard nut to crack. And people rarely say, I need a negotiator. That's not the category that they reach for. Find an area that really interests you substantively, whether it's, complicated sales, whether it's a particular area of technology, whether it's otherwise, and become an expert in that while developing your capacity to negotiate in a broad sense, in the sense of how do you get people with different interests and different perspectives to collaborate in a way that creates value? That's a very general description of what I think negotiation is. People who see the world differently, who have different interests, but nevertheless might well be able to agree to something that's way better than what they could do otherwise. And that's really what you're doing. And if you develop the skill at that, married to substantive expertise, that's a lot rarer than, say, technical knowledge of programming or, a lot of things which themselves are challenging. And you don't get hired for that necessarily, but you'll progress as a result of that in an area that you care a lot about. That's the other piece I might, when you ask me about advice, every time you deal with a challenging interaction, write down what you did in reflection, what you might have done differently. Keep a deal diary, because sometimes experience just means making the same mistake over and over, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes not. But if you are self-conscious and you do this, over time, experience adds up to real increases in capability. Because as you say, if you're a parent, how often do you negotiate? It's daily. Thanks for having me on. I really, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope it's useful to your listeners.
Absolutely, Jim. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time.
You're more than welcome.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast, and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And thanks for listening.